An elderly man refused treatment from a black doctor. But when his heart stopped beating, what happened next stunned everyone in the A. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, spilling golden light through the tall windows of St. Andrew's Hospital. Each beam cut across the corridor like a spotlight, catching on polished floors that gleamed with a sterile, almost unforgiving brightness. The shadows stretched long and thin, bending over chairs, walls, and the restless figures that filled the waiting areas. It was the kind of light that carried both warmth and unease, beautiful outside the hospital walls, yet strangely harsh within them, as if it had no business mixing with the scent of antiseptic and the constant murmur of machines. The hospital hummed with urgency. A gurney rattled down the hallway, pushed quickly by two nurses whose faces carried the quiet determination of routine emergencies. The wheels squealed slightly as they turned the corner, and the echo of their footsteps merged with the steady chorus of machines. Somewhere nearby, a heart monitor kept time like a metronome, steady, rhythmic, insistent. It was joined by the occasional shrill alarm, piercing the air and demanding immediate attention. Families sat scattered across rows of waiting room chairs, their expressions painted with exhaustion, worry, or the faintest spark of hope. A young boy clutched his mother's hand so tightly his knuckles were white, while she whispered reassurances into his ear, though her eyes betrayed fear. A middle-aged man paced back and forth by the vending machine, his phone pressed against his ear, speaking in urgent, clipped tones. Conversations were hushed, but the tension was palpable, thick enough to cling to every word. Through this restless tide of movement and sound walked a figure whose presence seemed to both command attention and blend into the routine all at once. Dr. Elijah Cole moved at a steady, deliberate pace, his footsteps measured, his posture straight. He carried himself with a calm that stood in sharp contrast to the chaos swirling around him. His lab coat, crisp though slightly creased from long hours, trailed behind him as he walked. A stethoscope rested against his neck, its metal glinting. Briefly, when it caught the afternoon light, there was an authority about him, an invisible weight that spoke not of arrogance but of quiet mastery. Yet behind his calm exterior, there were signs that not everyone noticed. His eyes, dark and thoughtful, carried the heaviness of too many sleepless nights and too many lives balanced precariously in his hands. The faint shadows beneath them hinted at the toll of countless shifts that blurred one into the next. His shoulders bore the unseen weight of responsibility, though he wore it with a practiced ease, as though he had long since accepted it as part of who he was. He paused briefly at the nurse's station, scanning a chart handed to him by a young nurse. She spoke quickly, rattling off symptoms and lab results, but he listened with patient attention, nodding slightly as his eyes traced the lines of information. When she finished, he offered a few quiet instructions, his voice calm, steady, and certain. It was the kind of voice that drew people in, one that inspired confidence even in the midst of fear. As he moved on, passing through the bustling corridor, a few heads turned. Some of the staff offered him small smiles of acknowledgement. Others, families waiting in quiet dread, looked up at him with the desperate, unspoken hope that perhaps he would be the one to deliver good news. He did not break stride, but there was a gentleness in his eyes, a subtle awareness of every gaze upon him. He carried not only his own burdens, but in some way, those of everyone around him. The light shifted again, throwing his shadow long across the polished floor. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as if the shadow itself carried the weight of his day, stretched thin, yet unbroken, a silent companion to the man who walked with such unwavering composure, though Dr. Cole appeared calm. Inside, he felt the familiar thrum of exhaustion pressing against the edges of his mind. The day had been long, and the cases relentless. A child with a severe asthma attack, a car accident victim clinging to life, an elderly woman whose breathing faltered with every passing hour. And yet, he pressed forward. He always did. For him, medicine was not simply a profession. It was a calling, a duty that demanded more than skill. It demanded resilience, compassion, and the willingness to stand firm in the storm of human suffering. As he reached the end of the corridor, another set of automatic doors slid open, releasing a gust of cooler, sterile air. Beyond them lay the emergency ward, a place where time itself seemed to move differently, where moments stretched and contracted in ways that defied normal rhythm. He stepped through without hesitation, ready for whatever awaited him inside. Hospital lived and breathed around him, its walls echoing with urgency, its halls thick with the weight of human frailty. And in the midst of it all, Dr. Elijah Cole moved with the steadiness of a man who had seen both the fragility of life and the strength it could reveal. Though the sun outside bathed the city in warmth, here within the hospital, his presence was the true source of light. The sliding doors burst open with a sudden hiss, breaking the steady rhythm of the ward. A gurney shot through, its wheels rattling against the floor, guided by two nurses moving with urgent precision. Upon it lay an elderly man, his skin pale and damp with sweat, his chest rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths. Each inhale sounded like a battle, his body straining as though the very air resisted him. Behind the gurney stumbled his family, a woman in her 50s clutching her purse to her chest, her face pale with worry, and a younger man who looked as though he had sprinted the entire way from the parking lot. Their voices overlapped in frantic bursts. "Please, help him. He's been having chest pains all morning. He couldn't even stand." The atmosphere, already taut with urgency, seemed to tighten further as the gurney came to a stop beneath the glaring lights of the emergency bay. Machines beeped in protest, recording the irregular rhythm of a failing heart. Dr. Elijah Cole stepped forward without hesitation, his expression calm but alert. He had seen countless emergencies before, but there was always a quiet gravity when someone arrived on the thin line between life and death. His eyes swept over the patient quickly, trained to notice the subtle signs, the gray tint of the lips, the clamminess of the skin, the rapid, uneven pulse. With practiced motion, he reached for his stethoscope, leaning in to assess the man's chest. But before the cold metal could touch skin, the patient's hand shot up, weak but deliberate. His fingers curled around Dr. Cole's wrist with surprising force for someone so frail. The man's eyes opened, clouded with pain yet sharpened with something else, something bitter, something that cut deeper than his failing heart. Through cracked lips he forced the words out, jagged and cruel. "I don't want him. Get me someone else." The sound of it silenced the room instantly. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to slice through the steady beeping and the shuffling of feet. The air seemed to pause, heavy with the echo of prejudice spoken aloud in a place where life itself was hanging in the balance. The patient's daughter gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The younger man, the son, perhaps froze in place, torn between his father's words and the obvious desperation of the situation. A nurse standing nearby shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting between the doctor and the patient, unsure of what to do. Another nurse busied herself with the monitor cables, though her trembling hands betrayed her attempt to ignore the scene. Dr. Cole remained still for a moment, his wrist still caught in the man's grip. He felt the weakness in it, the tremor of muscles already failing, but also the sting of rejection embedded in the words. It wasn't the first time, it might not be the last. But in that moment, it landed with a heaviness that no years of experience could dull. He withdrew his hand gently, not resisting, not forcing himself on a man who had so clearly drawn a line. His eyes, however, did not harden. They held steady, professional, calm though behind them. A flicker of weariness stirred, a familiar ache that no amount of training could erase. "I understand," Dr. Cole said softly, his voice even, almost too calm for the tension in the room. "We'll get someone else." The words did not come from weakness but from discipline, from the professionalism of a man who had built his career on composure, even when faced with scorn. The elderly man sank back against the gurney, groaning as another wave of pain tore through his chest. He clutched at his shirt, fingers twisting in the fabric, but his eyes remained defiant, locked on the doctor he had just rejected. The silence stretched, broken only by the frantic beeping of the monitors and the ragged sound of his breathing. Every nurse in the room seemed frozen in place, caught between duty and discomfort. None of them spoke. None of them knew how to bridge the impossible gap that had been carved by a single sentence. Dr. Cole stood quietly at the foot of the gurney, his hands now folded behind his back. Outwardly, he appeared composed, but inside, the moment weighed on him. He could feel the familiar press of frustration against his ribs, the burn of words unspoken. He had saved lives in this very ward, young and old, rich and poor, grateful and ungrateful alike. And yet here he was, pushed aside not because of his ability, but because of the color of his skin. The daughter found her voice first. She leaned forward, her words rushed and desperate. "Dad, please, he's a doctor. Let him help you." But the man only shook his head weakly, his face contorted not just in pain but in stubbornness. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his body fighting, yet his pride clinging just as fiercely. The younger man stepped closer, whispering, "Dad, you don't have time for this." But his words fell flat against the weight of prejudice too deeply rooted. The nurses exchanged nervous glances, their bodies tense with indecision. They looked to Dr. Cole for direction, as though silently pleading for him to take control, to override the patient's demand. But protocol was clear. A patient who refused care could not be forced, and so the room lingered in a strange, unbearable limbo, caught between urgency and insult, between a doctor's oath to heal and a man's refusal to be touched by the very hands that might save him. Dr. Cole took a slow breath, steadying himself. His voice, when he finally spoke, was measured, deliberate, carrying a calmness that steadied the uneasy air. "Keep monitoring his vitals," he instructed the nurses. "I'll be nearby if anything changes." And with that, he stepped back, retreating into the periphery of the room. The elderly man's labored groans filled the space he left behind, while the silence of the staff lingered like a shadow, heavy and unresolved. The silence that followed the elderly man's rejection was short-lived. Almost immediately, his body began to betray him. His breathing grew more ragged, chest rising and falling in uneven bursts, as though each inhale was being stolen from him, rather than freely given. A sheen of sweat broke across his forehead, gathering at his temples and sliding down into the creases of his face. His skin, already pale, began to shift toward a sickly gray, clammy under the harsh fluorescent light. The monitors responded in kind. The steady beeps that had once filled the room with reassurance now stumbled into erratic, uneven spikes. Each note pierced the air like the tick of a relentless clock, counting down to an end no one dared to name. The sound seemed to echo louder, with each passing second, vibrating through the nerves of everyone present. The daughter gripped the side rail of the gurney, her knuckles blanching as panic spread across her face. "Dad, please let him help you. You can't keep this up." Her voice wavered, desperation cracking through her words, but the old man turned his head away stubbornly, jaw clenched against both pain and reason. His breath came in short gasps, yet his pride refused to yield. "No," he rasped, forcing the syllable through gritted teeth. "I said no." His son looked on, torn between anger and fear. His eyes darted between his father's convulsing chest and the doctor who stood only a step away. "This is insane," he muttered under his breath, though not loud enough for his father to hear. Shame colored his features, the kind that comes when love for a parent collides with the humiliation of witnessing their darkest flaws laid bare. Through it all, Dr. Elijah Cole stood still, his expression a mask of composure. He had faced prejudice before, in words, in stares, in doors closed to him long before he had earned the right to open them. Yet somehow, in the sterile brightness of the emergency room, under the weight of monitors screaming for intervention. The sting cut deeper. Still, he did not flinch. He folded his hands lightly behind his back, not as a gesture of surrender, but of restraint, holding his professionalism like armor. His eyes, however, betrayed him. They never strayed from the patient's chest, from the rhythm that faltered beneath fragile ribs, from the monitor that sang out the warning of what was to come. "Keep monitoring his vitals," Dr. Cole said quietly, his voice calm but edged with urgency. His tone carried no bitterness, only the steady cadence of authority. "Call out any change immediately." The nurses nodded, though their unease lingered. One adjusted the 4-line, her hands trembling as though the tension of the moment seeped directly into her fingers. Another checked the oxygen mask, ensuring it was fitted properly, though her glance drifted repeatedly toward Dr. Cole, as if silently willing him to take charge despite the patient's refusal. The daughter's pleading grew softer now, replaced by whispered prayers under her breath. Her lips trembled as she pressed them to her clasped hands, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. The son stood rigid at her side, pacing occasionally before returning to the bed, helplessness etched into every restless step. Meanwhile, the patient clung to his prejudice with the last vestiges of his strength. His breaths rattled like loose coins in a tin, uneven and shallow. He shifted uncomfortably, his hand gripping the edge of the gurney as though holding on to the only power he had left, the power to refuse. His body betrayed him, yet his pride stood unyielding. Every sound in the room sharpened, the shuffle of shoes on linoleum, the whisper of fabric as nurses adjusted machines, the steady hum of the fluorescent lights. But above all, it was the monitor that commanded attention. Its irregular beeping filled the space with the sound of inevitability, each tone louder than the last, like the hand of a clock striking closer and closer to an unseen hour. Dr. Cole inhaled deeply, steadying himself. He could feel the storm gathering not just in the patient's failing body, but in the room itself. Fear hung thick in the air, pressing against everyone present. It was the kind of fear that demanded action, that screamed for intervention, yet shackled itself in silence because of one man's stubborn words. For a moment, Dr. Cole closed his eyes. He thought of the countless patients he had treated, the ones who trusted him instantly, the ones who looked past his skin and saw only the doctor, the healer. He thought, too, of the others, the ones who had turned away, who had doubted him, who had cut him with quiet or not-so-quiet rejection. It was not new, and yet it was never easy. When he opened his eyes again, his gaze was steady, sharp, unyielding. He would not abandon his post, no matter how loudly prejudice spoke. He would wait, he would watch. And when the moment came, because he knew it would come, he would act. The monitor spiked again, jagged and erratic, and a sharp alarm rang out. The nurses flinched, their eyes snapping back to the screen. The daughter sobbed openly now, pressing her forehead to her father's arm. The son gripped the bedrail, his jaw clenched tight, his chest rising with silent anger. And Dr. Cole, standing just beyond the reach of the man who had rejected him, remained like a shadow at the edge of the storm, calm, steady, unshaken. His eyes did not leave the patient's faltering heartbeat. Every beat, every breath, was a countdown. The room was caught in the pull of inevitability, suspended between pride and collapse. And with each passing second, with each piercing beep of the monitor, the clock ticked closer to the crisis none of them could avoid. The elderly man's chest heaved violently, his back arching against the gurney, as though his body were fighting one last desperate battle. His eyes widened, then rolled back, and with a shudder, he collapsed against the mattress. His head lolled to the side, lips slack, breath gone. For a split second, silence swallowed the room. Then the monitor screamed. A high, continuous alarm pierced the air, the flatline sound that every medical professional dreads. The steady rhythm of life had vanished, replaced by a siren of death. Chaos erupted instantly. The daughter let out a shrill cry, clutching her father's arm as tears flooded down her cheeks. The son froze in stunned disbelief before shouting, "Help him! Do something!" His voice cracked under the weight of panic. The nurses exchanged frantic glances, their hands hovering uselessly over equipment. Fear gripped them like chains. One nurse stammered, "Dr. Harper is still in surgery. What do we do?" Another whispered, "We can't wait, he's crashing." But their movements were halting, disjointed, like dancers stumbling out of rhythm. Time was slipping, each second bleeding into the next, and with it, the man's fragile chance at survival. And then, cutting through the storm like a blade through fog, came a voice firm, commanding, unshakable, "Move the crash cart now." The order cracked through the panic, and every head turned toward Dr. Elijah Cole. His calm composure was gone, replaced by decisive authority. He moved swiftly to the patient's side, rolling up his sleeves with practiced efficiency. His voice carried the weight of experience, and in that moment, there was no room for doubt, no space for prejudice, only action. The nurses jumped into motion, galvanized by his command. One wheeled the crash cart to the bedside, its drawers rattling. Another ripped open a package of sterile gloves, while a third prepared the defibrillator pads, her trembling steadied by the clarity of direction. Dr. Cole placed the heel of his hand firmly on the man's chest, interlocking his fingers. His arms locked straight, his body moving with rhythmic force as he began compressions. Each push drove deep into the patient's sternum, forcing the heart to remember its duty. 1, 2, 3, 4. His voice counted steadily, a cadence of determination, as sweat already began to form at his temples. "Bag him," he ordered. A nurse slipped the mask over the man's face, squeezing oxygen into failing lungs. Another prepared in 4-line, the needle sliding into the patient's arm with trembling urgency. "Charge to 200. Dr. Cole commanded, not pausing, not faltering. The defibrillator whined as it powered up, the sound slicing through the room like electricity itself. The daughter had collapsed into her son's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. The son held her tightly, his face a portrait of despair and helpless fury. Yet both of them could not look away from the scene unfolding. This man they had doubted, this doctor their father had scorned, fighting harder for his life than anyone else in the room. "Clear." Dr. Cole's voice rang out. The nurses stepped back. He pressed the paddles to the patient's chest, and a violent jolt arced through the man's body, lifting him momentarily from the gurney before he crashed back down. The monitor flickered flatline, then jagged peaks, then flatline again. The room held its breath. "Resume compressions," Dr. Cole ordered immediately, moving back into rhythm. His arms pumped relentlessly, the sound of his count cutting through the tears and gasps around him. "Stay with me," he muttered under his breath, his words for the patient alone. Seconds stretched into eternities. Each beep, each pause, each faltering line on the screen felt like the hand of fate dangling cruelly above them. The air reeked of antiseptic and sweat, charged with tension so thick it weighed on every chest. "Charge to 300 now." Dr. Cole barked. The machine whined again, louder, more urgent. His eyes never left the patient, his focus sharp as a blade. "Clear." Another jolt. Another violent arch of the man's body. The monitor hesitated, its line jagged, uncertain. Then beep. A single small spike. Another, and another. The rhythm returned. Unsteady at first, but the room exhaled collectively, a sigh of fragile relief. The daughter sobbed anew, this time in gratitude, clinging to her son as though she might collapse without him. The nurses looked at one another, wide-eyed, their fear replaced by awe. Dr. Cole didn't stop immediately. He continued compressions, checking the pulse, verifying the rhythm. Only when the monitor steadied with a weak but consistent beat did he allow himself to pause. He leaned back, chest heaving, sweat rolling down his face. His hands, trembling slightly from the exertion, rested on the edge of the gurney. The man's eyelids fluttered. His chest rose with shallow, uneven breaths, but he was alive. Against the prejudice that had denied him, against the pride that had nearly killed him, life had returned. For a moment, no one spoke. The truth of what had just occurred hung heavy in the air. The racist words that had silenced the room before were now eclipsed by the undeniable reality. The very doctor who had been rejected had refused to reject him in return. Dr. Cole finally straightened, adjusting his gloves and wiping his brow. His voice, though tired, was steady. "Keep him on oxygen. Monitor closely. Let's stabilize him before we move him upstairs." The staff moved instantly, their steps precise, their actions fluid. The confusion that had once reigned was gone, replaced by unity under the leadership of the man who had taken control when no one else could dot in the corner. The son's eyes glistened with tears. He whispered hoarsely, almost to himself, "He saved him." The daughter nodded through her sobs, her gaze locked on Dr. Cole with a mix of gratitude and shame. And at the center of it all stood the doctor, calm, resolute, steady, a man who had chosen compassion over pride, action over anger, and life over prejudice. The seconds stretched unbearably, each one thick with dread. Then finally the flat line broke. A weak spike appeared on the monitor, followed by another and another. The rhythm steadied, faint but unmistakably alive. The shrill alarm softened, back into the familiar cadence of beeps, fragile yet triumphant. A collective breath swept through the room. Shoulders slumped with relief. Nurses wiped their eyes without realizing tears had fallen. The daughter clung to her son's arm as though she might collapse, whispering thanks to no one in particular. The son simply stood frozen, stunned by the miracle unfolding before him. At the center of it all, Dr. Elijah Cole remained, his palm still pressed firmly against the patient's chest. His body glistened with sweat, the thin cotton of his shirt clinging to his back beneath the lab coat. His breathing was heavy, measured in deep exhales that carried the weight of the battle just fought. On the gurney, the elderly man stirred. His eyelids fluttered weakly, lashes trembling against skin that was still pale and clammy. With visible effort, his eyes cracked open, cloudy with fatigue, yet still searching for some anchor in the blur of light and shadow. And the first thing he saw was the man he had rejected. Dr. Cole's face hovered above him, damp with sweat, his brow furrowed with exertion. His hands, strong, steady, unrelenting, were still poised over the chest they had refused to let fall silent. The doctor's dark eyes were fixed on him, sharp with focus, but not with judgment. No bitterness lingered in them, only a quiet, unwavering concern. The irony of the moment pressed down like a weight upon the room. The man who had spat out rejection, who had insisted this doctor was unworthy of touching him, was alive only because those same hands had refused to let go. The elderly man's lips quivered as if he wanted to speak, but no words came. His throat rasped dryly, his body too weak to summon anything more than a groan. He blinked once, then twice, his gaze holding fast to the figure before him. Dr. Cole leaned back slowly, exhaling deeply. His chest rose and fell, exhaustion etched across every line of his body. And yet when he spoke, his voice was calm, gentle, carrying none of the resentment that could have so easily taken root. "You're safe now," he said quietly. The words settled in the air with a finality greater than any reprimand could have carried. They were not triumphant, not bitter. They were simple, compassionate, certain. The daughter broke into sobs at the sound of them, covering her mouth as though the weight of relief was too heavy to release. She turned to her brother, clutching his sleeve. "He saved him," she whispered, her voice shaking. "He saved Dad." The son nodded slowly, though his eyes never left Dr. Cole. Gratitude swelled within him, mingled with shame, not for himself, but for the prejudice that had nearly cost his father his life. He opened his mouth to speak, but words failed him. Trapped beneath the enormity of the moment, the elderly man's gaze lingered on the doctor. There was something in his expression, confusion, perhaps, or disbelief. His pride, so fierce and unyielding, faltered under the undeniable truth before him. He was alive. And the man responsible was the very one he had deemed unworthy. For a brief moment, it looked as though tears might rise in his eyes. But he blinked them back, his jaw tightening with the stubbornness of a lifetime. No apology came. No words of thanks passed his lips. Only silence, and yet Dr. Cole did not demand them. He did not need them. He adjusted his gloves, gave a brief nod to the nurses, and stepped aside to allow them to continue stabilizing the patient. His focus shifted effortlessly to the next steps: oxygen levels, 4 fluids, cardiac medication. His movements were clinical. Precise, unwavering. To him, this was not about winning an argument. It was about saving a life. Still, the weight of the moment was not lost on those who watched. The nurses, once frozen in uncertainty, now followed his lead with renewed determination. Their glances carried something more than respect. It was admiration, almost reverence, for the man who had risen above insult to fulfill his oath. The family watched in silence, each caught in their own storm of emotions. The daughter wept openly, torn between gratitude and shame. The son stood stiff, fists clenched at his sides, anger simmering at the injustice his father had inflicted on the very man who had saved him. And the patient himself lay quietly, eyes half closed, the truth gnawing at him louder than any monitor could. The beeps of the heart monitor continued steadily, fragile yet persistent. Each one was a reminder not just of survival, but of the compassion that had carried him through. When the flurry of stabilization slowed, Dr. Cole finally stepped back, his shoulders heavy but his expression calm. For the first time since the ordeal began, he allowed himself a moment of stillness. His eyes closed briefly, a sigh escaping his lips, not of frustration, but of release. He had done his duty. He had honored his oath. And though the man on the bed may never say the words, though prejudice might still cling to him like a second skin, the truth was unshakable. He was alive only because of the one he had dismissed. Dr. Cole opened his eyes again, meeting the gaze of the patient one last time. He gave a faint nod, a gesture of acknowledgement that required no words. Then, with quiet dignity, he turned his attention to the next task, already moving forward while the rest of the room lingered in the gravity of what had just transpired. The irony hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Hatred had refused his care. Compassion had saved his life. The room felt strangely still after the storm. The monitors continued their steady rhythm. The hiss of oxygen flowed into the patient's lungs, and the fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. Yet beneath those familiar sounds lay an unspoken weight, heavier than the crash cart, heavier than the frantic minutes of compressions. It was the weight of what had just transpired, and everyone in the room felt it pressing into their chests. The daughter was the first to move. She rushed forward, gripping Dr. Cole's sleeve with trembling hands. Her tears flowed freely, carving streaks down her flushed cheeks. Thank you so much," she whispered, the words tumbling over themselves in desperate repetition. Her voice cracked with each syllable, as though gratitude alone could not hold back the tidal wave of guilt rising within her. Her brother joined her, his eyes glistening though he tried to blink the tears away. His composure cracked at last, and he clasped the doctor's hand tightly, shaking it with both of his own. "We owe you everything," he said, his voice low but fierce with conviction. He glanced toward the hospital bed, then back to the doctor, shame pulling at his expression. "You didn't have to, after what he said, you didn't have to do it. But you did, and you saved him." Dr. Cole returned the handshake, steady and controlled. His face betrayed no bitterness, no trace of wounded pride. only calm professionalism. His voice, when it came, was quiet, measured. "He was my patient," he said simply. That's all that mattered. The son swallowed hard, nodding slowly. He wanted to say more, to apologize on behalf of his father, to ask forgiveness for words that could never be taken back. But when he opened his mouth, nothing emerged. Instead, he lowered his gaze, overcome by the same mixture of relief and shame that twisted inside his sister. The elderly man lay silent on the gurney. His chest rose and fell shallowly beneath the thin hospital gown, the monitor beside him tracing each fragile beat. His eyes were half closed, not from sleep, but from the crushing weight of realization. Shame etched itself into the deep lines of his face, settling heavier than the exhaustion of survival. He had looked into the eyes of the man he scorned, looked and seen nothing but compassion, even as his own heart betrayed him. He had spat out rejection, and in return, he had been given life. Now, with every beep of the monitor, the truth pulsed louder inside him than the blood in his veins. His hatred had nearly killed him. His lips parted, but no sound came. Pride, stubborn and jagged, caught in his throat. An apology trembled at the edges of his mind, unspoken, unshaped. He wanted to form the words to acknowledge, to surrender, to admit the weight of his wrongdoing. But decades of ingrained prejudice locked his tongue in silence. All he could do was stare, eyes glistening faintly, at the man who had saved him. Dr. Cole did not demand his words. He did not linger expectantly, waiting for gratitude that might never come. He checked the patient's vitals again, his movements efficient, his tone steady as he issued quiet instructions to the nurse. He adjusted the four-drip, ensured the oxygen mask was secure, and confirmed that the crash cart was restocked. To him, this was simply another case, another life pulled back from the brink. And yet, the nurses who had watched from the edges of chaos carried something more in their eyes now. They had seen what others had missed, the insult, the refusal, the humiliation swallowed in silence. And then they had seen the same man rise above it all with unshakable resolve, compassion where there should have been resentment, steadfastness where others might have faltered, grace in the face of prejudice. The daughter sobbed harder, pressing her forehead into her brother's shoulder. "He doesn't deserve this kind of kindness," she whispered hoarsely. "Not after what he said. But thank God you didn't walk away." Dr. Cole turned to her, his expression kind but firm. "Everyone deserves care," he replied, "especially when they need it most." His words were not meant as a rebuke, yet they carried the weight of a lesson, one that reached beyond the sterile white walls of the emergency room. The siblings absorbed them in silence, their tears now a mixture of sorrow, gratitude, and the painful recognition of how deeply their father's prejudice had failed him. The elderly man's eyes flickered shut, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. But his silence was no longer that of rejection. It was the silence of a man stripped bare before truth, a man too proud to speak, yet too shaken to deny what had just been shown to him. The room began to quiet, the storm of emotions settling into a fragile calm. Nurses moved gently, their footsteps softer now, as though even they understood the delicacy of this aftermath. The siblings lingered near the doctor, whispering thanks again and again, their voices raw, their gratitude insistent, as though repetition might somehow atone for the insult their father had hurled. But Dr. Cole did not cling to their words. He acknowledged them with nods, his composure unbroken. He had learned long ago that recognition was not his to chase, nor was prejudice his to correct in the heat of crisis. His duty was to heal, and he had done exactly that. Still, as he looked one last time at the man lying on the bed alive, ashamed, silent, something stirred faintly in his chest. Not triumph, not anger, something quieter. Perhaps hope that survival itself might plant a seed. That life, restored by compassion, might speak louder than hate ever could. Without another word, Dr. Cole turned toward the door. His steps were calm, steady, purposeful. Behind him, the family wept with mingled gratitude and guilt. On the bed, the patient stared into the ceiling, his silence heavy with shame. And within the quiet of that room, one truth lingered, undeniable. Hatred had been answered with compassion, and compassion had won.